A simple bathtub, hot water, steam rising like whispers in the silence. What happened in that small bathroom in Munich changed music history forever. But what really drove Freddie Mercury to lock himself away on that rain-soaked German evening in 1979? The truth behind one of Queen's biggest hits isn't what you think. It was October 15th, 1979. The Musicland studios in Munich were buzzing with activity. Queen was in the middle of recording what would become the Game album. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Freddie Mercury, the man who commanded stadiums with a single gesture, was falling apart. The pressure was crushing him. Critics were calling Queen outdated. Disco was dominating the charts with Donna Summer and Chic. Punk rock was declaring them irrelevant dinosaurs. And behind closed doors, Freddie was battling demons that threatened to destroy everything he built over 13 years of relentless touring and recording. Munich had been chosen as their recording base for a reason. Away from the suffocating London music press, away from the expectations of Trident Studios, where they'd created their masterpieces, away from the ghosts of their past successes that now felt like chains around their necks. The German city offered anonymity, a chance to reinvent themselves without the world watching their every move. But instead of freedom, Freddie found himself trapped in a different kind of prison, one made of his own fears and insecurities. That night, as rain hammered against the studio windows like accusations, Freddie made a decision that would change everything. He walked away from the mixing board, where he'd been obsessing over guitar tones for hours, away from the band who were growing increasingly concerned about his behavior. Away from the expectations that had been suffocating him for months, he headed to his hotel room at the Bayerischer Hof, one of Munich's most prestigious establishments. But he wasn't going to sleep. He wasn't going to call his friends or drown his sorrows in the hotel bar. He was going to face the voice that had been haunting him for months. The voice that told him he was a fraud. What happened next in that hotel bathroom would prove that voice devastatingly wrong. But it would also transform Freddie Mercury from a performer desperately trying to meet expectations into an artist willing to risk everything for truth. Munich, 1979. The city where shadows seemed longer and secrets ran deeper than anywhere else in Europe. Freddie Mercury wasn't just in Germany to record an album. He was running from London tabloids that dissected his every relationship, running from band tensions that threatened to tear Queen apart at the seams, running from a truth about himself he wasn't ready to face in the unforgiving glare of British media attention. The Musicland studios, owned by disco king Giorgio Moroder, had become his sanctuary and his prison. For 6 weeks, he'd been working 18-hour days, pushing his voice beyond its limits, demanding perfection from every note, every harmony, every breath. The studio's state-of-the-art equipment and soundproof walls should have been liberating. Instead, they felt like a tomb. Roger Taylor had been watching Freddie with growing concern. The drummer who'd known Freddie since their early days as Smile could see through the theatrical masks and designer clothes. "He's not eating," Roger confided to Brian May one evening as they shared a quiet beer in the studio lounge. "He's barely sleeping. Something's eating him alive from the inside." Brian nodded grimly. The guitarist had seen it too. The way Freddie's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. The way his famous confidence cracked the moment the recording light went off and the performance mask could slip. John Deacon, the quiet bass player who observed everything and said little, had his own theory. "It's not just the music," he told the others during one of their worried conferences. "It's everything. The fame, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, and the other things we don't talk about." The other things were what nobody in the band discussed openly, but everyone understood. Freddie's increasingly reckless lifestyle, his desperate search for connection in a world that saw him only as an icon, his growing isolation despite being surrounded by people constantly, Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. That October evening started like any other. Freddie arrived at Musicland Studios wearing his usual black leather jacket. His hair perfectly styled, his mustache impeccably groomed, but his eyes told a different story. They carried the weight of a man who had been pretending to be invincible for so long that he'd forgotten how to be human. The session was supposed to focus on vocals for their ambitious new album, tracks that would showcase Queen's evolution, their maturity, their continued relevance in a rapidly changing musical landscape. But when the red recording light illuminated the vocal booth, something inside Freddie finally broke. "Let's try the vocal on track 7 again," he announced to the sound engineer, his voice carrying that familiar authority that had commanded respect from musicians, producers, and audiences worldwide. But when he stepped into the vocal booth and put on the headphones, the magic wasn't there. The note wouldn't come. The power that had carried him through Bohemian Rhapsody, We Are the Champions, and countless other masterpieces simply wasn't there. For the first time in his professional career, Freddie Mercury's voice failed him completely. The silence in the control room was deafening. Roger, Brian, and John exchanged glances filled with concern and confusion. They'd never seen Freddie like this. Vulnerable, exposed, utterly heartbreakingly human. "I need some air," Freddie muttered, pulling off his headphones with trembling hands and walking out of the booth. But instead of heading outside to the rain-soaked Munich streets, he went straight to his waiting car and asked the driver to take him back to the hotel. The Bayerischer Hof was Munich's most luxurious hotels, a place where royalty and celebrities could hide behind thick walls and discreet staff. But luxury couldn't fix what was broken inside Freddie Mercury. Money couldn't buy back the confidence that seemed to be evaporating with each passing day. Room 447, his sanctuary, his cage, his refuge from a world that demanded perfection while offering no forgiveness for human frailty. He poured himself a glass of vodka from the well-stocked minibar. Then another. The rain outside grew heavier, matching the storm inside his soul. The city lights of Munich blurred through the hotel windows like tears on glass. That's when he heard it. The voice. Not his singing voice. The voice that had made him famous and wealthy and adored by millions. The other voice. The cruel, relentless voice that had been growing louder every day. "You're nothing without the costume, Farouk." His real name. The name he tried to bury under layers of theatrical persona and rock star mythology. Farrukh Bulsara. The awkward, insecure boy from Zanzibar who had dreamed of being someone else. Someone important. Someone worthy of love. The bathroom door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silence of room 447. In the stillness that followed, Freddie Mercury began to strip away more than just his clothes. He began to strip away the layers of protection he'd built around his soul. The mirror reflected a man the world thought they knew. Freddie Mercury, the flamboyant frontman of Queen. The theatrical genius who could command an audience of 80,000 people with a single gesture. The confident rock god who wore his sexuality and his talent like royal robes. But Freddie saw something different in that reflection. He saw every insecurity he'd ever buried beneath sequins and stage lights. Every fear he'd drowned in applause and adoration. Every moment of self-doubt that he'd hidden behind his carefully constructed persona. The bathtub was already filling with hot water, steam rising like incense in a cathedral of ceramic tiles and chrome fixtures. But this wasn't about getting clean. This ritual had nothing to do with hygiene and everything to do with honesty. This was about washing away the lies he'd been telling himself. As he sank into the scalding water, Freddie closed his eyes and let the heat penetrate his bones, his muscles, his very soul. For the first time in months, the constant noise in his head began to quiet. The voices of critics, the demands of record executives, the expectations of millions of fans all faded into the background. And in that blessed silence, something else began to emerge. A melody, simple, raw, unlike anything Queen had ever recorded or even attempted. It started as barely a whisper, a few notes that seemed to float on the steam rising from the water. Then a rhythm began to form, tapped out by his pruning fingers against the porcelain edge of the expensive hotel bathtub. The sound was hollow, primitive, almost childlike in its simplicity. But this wasn't just any melody. This was rebellion in its purest form. The critics wanted complexity, progressive arrangements that required music degrees to fully appreciate. He'd give them 3 chords. 3 simple, honest chords that any kid with a guitar could play. They wanted conceptual albums about space and fantasy. He'd give them pure, unadulterated human emotion. They wanted the theatrical excess that had made Queen famous. He'd give them something even more dangerous, truth. "Crazy little thing called love," he whispered to the empty bathroom, the words emerging from somewhere deep inside him. Somewhere he'd forgotten existed. Somewhere that predated the fame and the pressure and the constant performance. The melody grew stronger, more insistent. His voice, the voice that had failed him so completely just hours before in the studio, now rang clear and powerful in the steam-filled sanctuary of his hotel bathroom. It was as if the vulnerability of the moment had unlocked something that had been trapped inside him for years. As the hot water surrounded him like a liquid embrace, Freddie began to remember who he'd been before the fame, before the pressure, before the fear of failure consumed him. He remembered a young man named Farak who loved music not for what it could give him, but for how it made him feel, who wrote songs not to impress critics or sell records, but to express truths that couldn't be spoken any other way. The song that was being born in that moment wasn't just about romantic love, though that's how the world would interpret it. It was about something deeper, something more universal. It was about finding yourself when the world has convinced you that you're lost, about remembering your own humanity when everyone around you wants you to be superhuman. The water was beginning to cool, but Freddie's creative fire was burning hotter than it had in months. He could see the whole song now, feel its structure, taste its possibility. It would be different from anything Queen had ever done. It would be simple where they had been complex, raw where they had been polished, honest where they had been theatrical, and it would save them. He could feel it in his bones. Steam swirled around him like creative spirits as Freddie's fingers moved through the cooling water, conducting an invisible orchestra that only he could hear. The melody was growing, evolving, demanding to be taken seriously despite its deceptive simplicity. But this wasn't going to be a Queen song, not as the world knew Queen anyway. For 7 years they'd been the kings of complexity. Multi-layered harmonies that took weeks to perfect. Guitar solos that required conservatory training to fully appreciate. Songs that were architectural marvels of sound, constructed with the precision of Swiss watchmakers and the ambition of cathedral builders. Bohemian Rhapsody had 6 distinct sections and took 3 weeks to record. We Are the Champions featured orchestral arrangements that involved dozens of musicians. Even their simplest songs were crafted with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made them one of the most respected bands in the world. This was different. This was dangerous. 3 chords, a simple progression that any guitarist could master in 10 minutes. No orchestral arrangements, no operatic sections, no complex time signatures that required mathematical precision to execute. No layered vocals that took days to record and mix. Just pure, raw, unfiltered honesty. "They're gonna hate it," Freddie whispered to himself as he let the melody plate at his head. And for the first time in months, he smiled. Really smiled. Not the practice smile he wore for photographers and fans, but a genuine expression of joy and rebellion. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simplify. Sometimes rebellion means going backward instead of forward. Sometimes the biggest risk you can take is being real when everyone expects you to be spectacular. He would channel Elvis, not the Vegas Elvis that critics mocked and dismissed as a parody of his former self. The young, dangerous Elvis who had changed everything by refusing to apologize for who he was. The Elvis who had taken rhythm and blues and country music and merged them into something that had never existed before. The Elvis who had been raw and sexual and honest when the world wanted its entertainers to be safe and sanitized. This song would be Freddie Mercury naked, not physically, but musically and emotionally. Stripped of all the theatrical costumes and elaborate stage productions and carefully crafted personas that had made him famous. Just a man with a melody and something true to say. The hotel phone rang, cutting through his reverie like a knife through silk. The sound was jarring, violent, bringing him back to the reality of hotel rooms and recording schedules, and a band waiting for him to pull himself together. It was Roger, his voice tight with concern. "Fred, where are you? We're waiting at the studio. The engineer's been sitting here for 2 hours. I'm coming," Freddie said, his voice strange even to his own ears. Different, changed. "But Roger, when I get there, we're doing something completely different." "What do you mean?" "We've got the tracks planned out. The arrangements." "Forget the arrangements. Forget everything we've planned. Trust me." There was silence on the other end of the line. Roger had known Freddie long enough to recognize when the man was having one of his creative breakthroughs. They were rare, unpredictable, and usually resulted in either complete disasters or pure genius. Freddie hung up and rose from the cooling water, his skin red from the heat, his mind clearer than it had been in months. As he toweled off, he caught his reflection in the mirror again. But this time, he didn't see a fraud struggling to maintain an illusion. He didn't see someone pretending to be something he wasn't. He saw a revolutionary, someone about to change everything, someone about to prove that the simplest truths are often the most powerful. The walk back to Musicland Studios felt different. The rain had stopped, and the streets of Munich glistened like a pathway to redemption. Each step brought him closer to a moment that would either destroy his career or save it. But for the first time in months, Freddie wasn't afraid of failure. He was afraid of not trying. When Freddie burst through the studio doors at 2:47 a.m., his hair still damp from the bathtub, his eyes blazing with a purpose that none of them had seen in months, the band knew immediately that something fundamental had shifted. Roger looked up from behind his drum kit, where he'd been mindlessly tapping out rhythms while they waited. Brian set down his guitar and studied Freddie's face, searching for clues about what had happened in the hours since he'd left. John simply watched from his position by the bass amp, his quiet intelligence taking in every detail. The studio fell into complete silence as Freddie approached the piano. Not the grand Steinway they usually used for their ballads and complex arrangements. The old upright in the corner, the one that was slightly out of tune and had been relegated to demo work. The one that nobody important ever played for anything serious. Perfect. His fingers found the keys with a confidence that had been missing for weeks. 3 chords. Simple, honest, revolutionary. The melody that had been born in steam and vulnerability now filled the room like a manifesto. It was raw, immediate, undeniable. It demanded attention not through complexity or virtuosity, but through pure emotional honesty. Roger's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't Queen. This wasn't anything they'd ever attempted. This was something else entirely. Brian looked confused, almost offended. Where were the intricate guitar solos he'd been preparing? The complex harmonies they'd spent weeks arranging? The progressive elements that had become their signature? This sounded like something a garage band might play at their first rehearsal. John just listened, and slowly, despite himself, began to smile. Because sometimes the most sophisticated thing you can do is be simple. Sometimes genius lies not in showing off what you can do, but in knowing what you don't need to do. It's called Crazy Little Thing Called Love, Freddie announced, his voice carrying a confidence that had been absent for months. And we're going to record it. Tonight. Right now. Fred, Brian said carefully, his tone diplomatic but concerned, this is different from what we discussed. The album concept, the arrangements we've been working on. Exactly. But the fans expect us to surprise them. This will surprise everyone, including us. What happened next became the stuff of rock and roll legend. In less than 30 minutes, working with an urgency and spontaneity they hadn't felt since their earliest days, Queen recorded the basic track for what would become one of their biggest hits. No overdubs, no complications, no safety net of endless takes and perfectionist tweaking. Just four musicians playing together like they hadn't in years. Like they remembered why they'd started making music in the first place. Freddie's voice, the voice that had failed him so completely just hours earlier, now soared with newfound freedom and power. Because he wasn't trying to be the Freddie Mercury the world expected. He wasn't attempting to live up to the impossible standards he'd set for himself. He was just being honest, just being human, just being real. The song was captured in one take, perfect in its imperfection, revolutionary in its simplicity, dangerous in its honesty. When the last chord faded and the studio fell silent, something unexpected happened, something that none of them were prepared for. Freddie Mercury began to cry, not tears of sadness or frustration or artistic anguish, tears of relief, of release, of resurrection, tears that washed away months of fear and self-doubt and crushing pressure. The song wasn't just a potential hit. It wasn't just a radical departure from their established sound. It was Freddie Mercury's declaration of independence from the prison of his own expectations. It was his announcement that he was ready to be human again. The recording session ended as the sun rose over Munich, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise new beginnings. The city awakened to a world where Queen had just changed everything, though it wouldn't know it for months. Freddie walked back to his hotel as dawn broke over the ancient German city, feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight that had been crushing him for months was gone, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. But revolutions always come with consequences. Change always demands a price. When Crazy Little Thing Called Love was finally released as a single in October 1979, the music press didn't know what to make of it. Queen, the band known for epic compositions and theatrical excess, had recorded what some critics dismissed as a simple rock and roll song. The reviews were mixed, to put it kindly. Rolling Stone called it a puzzling departure. NME wondered if Queen had lost their ambition. Even some of their most loyal fans were confused by this radical simplification of their sound. Queen has lost their way, wrote one particularly brutal reviewer. This is beneath them. This is what happens when a band runs out of ideas and starts copying their betters instead of being themselves. But something else was happening. Something the critics couldn't predict or control or understand. People were connecting with the song in ways they hadn't connected with Queen's music in years. Radio stations that had been reluctant to play their more complex recent material were putting Crazy Little Thing Called Love in heavy rotation. It wasn't just about the melody. though that was undeniably catchy. It wasn't just about the energy, though that was infectious. It was about honesty, about a superstar admitting that sometimes the best thing you can do is strip everything away and just be real. About vulnerability being strength rather than weakness. The song shot to #1 in multiple countries, becoming Queen's biggest American hit up to that point. But more importantly, it saved Queen, and it saved Freddie. That night in the bathtub hadn't just produced a hit song, it had produced a transformation. Freddie Mercury had faced his darkest moment and emerged not just intact, but renewed, reborn, ready to embrace both his complexity and his simplicity. He began writing differently after that night. Songs came from a deeper place, a more honest place. He stopped trying to impress critics and started trying to connect with human beings. He performed differently too, with a freedom and spontaneity that audiences could feel even in the largest stadiums. The theatrical excess was still there. That was part of who he was, part of what made him unique. But now it came from a place of joy rather than desperation, from confidence rather than insecurity, from love rather than fear. Years later, in one of his final interviews, Freddie would say that Crazy Little Thing Called Love was the song that taught him the most important lesson of his career. Sometimes you have to go backward to go forward. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself. The bathtub in room 447 of the Bayerischer Hof became his secret sanctuary. Whenever the pressure mounted again, whenever the voice of doubt crept back in, Freddie would remember that night, that steam, that moment when simplicity saved him from the tyranny of his own expectations. But the real revolution wasn't just musical, it was personal. For the first time in his adult life, Freddie had allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of other people. He had let his bandmates see him cry, see him struggle, see him be human. And instead of losing their respect, he had gained their love. That night changed all of us. Roger Taylor would later recall, "We realized that we didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. We didn't have to hide our struggles to maintain our dignity. Freddie taught us that vulnerability could be a strength." Today, decades after that transformative October night, Crazy Little Thing Called Love remains one of Queen's most beloved songs. But its true power lies not in its commercial success, but in what it represents to anyone who has ever felt the crushing weight of their own expectations. The song became an anthem for authenticity in a world that often rewards pretense, a reminder that our greatest breakthroughs often come not from our strengths, but from our willingness to be vulnerable. That creativity flourishes not in comfort, but in moments of desperate honesty. The bathtub where Freddie Mercury wrote one of rock's greatest songs is gone now. The Bayerischer Hof has been renovated countless times since 1979. Room 447 looks nothing like it did that night when steam and vulnerability combined to create musical magic. But the lesson remains. Carved not in ceramic tiles, but in the hearts of everyone who has ever felt lost and found their way through art. Written not in hotel registries, but in the memories of millions who have found comfort in a simple song about love. Music historians often point to Crazy Little Thing Called Love as a turning point in Queen's career. The moment they stopped trying to be what everyone expected and started being what they actually were. But it was more than that. It was the moment Freddie Mercury stopped running from Farouk Bulsara and learned to love both parts of himself. The steam that rose from that bathtub carried away more than just the heat from hot water. It carried away years of fear, doubt, and self-imposed limitations. It cleared the air, not just in one hotel bathroom, but in the creative spirit of one of rock's greatest performers. Freddie Mercury died in 1991, believing that music was magic. But perhaps the real magic wasn't in the complexity of his compositions or the grandeur of his performances. Perhaps the real magic was in that moment when a superstar allowed himself to be human, when a king remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable, when an icon chose truth over image. In the end, Crazy Little Thing Called Love wasn't just a song about romantic love, though that's how millions interpreted it. It was a song about self-love, about accepting who you are when the costumes come off and the stage lights dim, about finding the courage to be simple in a world that demands complexity. And sometimes, late at night, when you're alone with your thoughts and the weight of the world feels too heavy to bear, remember this. Somewhere in Munich, in a small hotel bathroom filled with steam and possibility, Freddie Mercury proved that our greatest victories often begin with our willingness to be honest about our defeats. The truth, as it turns out, really can set you free. Even if it takes 3 chords, a bathtub, and the courage to let the world see you cry. But here's what they don't tell you about that night. What Freddie whispered to himself as he stepped out of that transformative bath. Words that would haunt and inspire him until his final performance at Wembley Stadium. 3 words, simple words, words that would become his secret mantra whenever the pressure threatened to consume him again. That secret died with him, or did it?